The decisions you're making right now about AI adoption, architecture trade-offs, and how your team works together will shape your systems for years. Getting those calls right when the landscape is shifting this fast is hard. QCon San Francisco has spent 20 years connecting senior engineers with practitioners who are a few steps ahead on the same problems. This November 16th through the 20th, 60-plus speakers across 12 tracks will share what's actually working in production and what isn't. No hidden product pitches, just senior practitioners helping senior practitioners. Learn more at QConSF.com.
Hello everybody, I'm Olympic Pop, an InfoQ editor, and I have in front of me Martin Kleppmann, who is probably one of the most known people in the data space because he wrote the Designing Data-Intensive Application, and he has a second edition that was not long ago launched. But without any further ado, herzlich willkommen, Martin. Can you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, sure. It's great to be here. So I'm an associate professor in Cambridge, where I teach and do research on distributed systems and some security protocols. I have also written now 2 editions of this Designing Data-Intensive Applications book for O'Reilly. I used to do startup software engineering back in a previous life before I switched over to academia.
Nice. Thank you for writing it. I read the first edition. I'm looking forward to starting the second edition. But for those of us that are not that patient in reading everything, what will be the things that changed in between? If I remember correctly, it's almost 1 decade since you first wrote the first edition.
Yeah, the first edition came out in 2017, so that's 9 years old now. So, of course, technology does move on in that sort of time. So part of the goal of the second edition was just to bring it up to date with shifts in technology. Partly it was also some things I've now learned to understand better myself. So we rewrote some of the explanations as well to hopefully be clearer now. But in terms of the technology that has changed, I would say one of the biggest things is the rise of cloud-native software architectures, which is a bit fuzzy. The term cloud-native is not exactly well-defined, but what we mean with this is systems that are built to take advantage of cloud services as opposed to local operating system services, which was the case previously. So historically, if you wanted to build a distributed database, you would write a piece of software that would store some data on the local disk of each node. And if you wanted to replicate it to another node, you would do that at the database software level. And then the replica would store its data on its local disk on that node. And with a bunch of modern systems, that's just not true anymore, because now people are building databases on top of object stores, for example. And so the underlying storage abstraction is an object store, not a local disk. And it's already inherently replicated at the object store level, which then changes the way you build things on top of it. And so, of course, we do still have the traditional form of databases nowadays, which you run on top of local disks. But there are now more and more systems that also take advantage of these cloud services as the underlying abstractions. And that's really an important shift that we wanted to weave in throughout the book. So we've kind of incorporated that idea throughout various chapters.
Great. One thing that I saw in the data space, for me, data was, the cylindrical block in the diagrams. I didn't touch it. I left it for the guys that really know how to handle that.
Yeah.
But in the last couple of weeks, maybe months, I spoke a lot with people that are actually designing and building data systems. And then a new passion, a lot of new interest into this arose in me. So one of the things that the conclusions to the conversation and also from what I was building is the fact that after a long period of time where you had only monolithic block also in the data space, you had everything was in one piece and you either build something or you bought something, everything seemed to be like huge data lakes and so on and so forth in the BI space. But now it feels that the revolution touched also the data space and you have more fragmented pieces that you can build the stuff. For instance, I had a conversation with the guys that built InfluxDB and they were just talking about the FDAP stack, as they call it, Apache Flight, Data Fusion, Apache Parquet, and Apache Arrow into building blocks. And then it's a lot easier now. And as you mentioned as well, object storage. Some of the things that appeared only as technologies, as it was the S3 buckets back in the day, now became de facto standards. S3 is one of these standards. Then you have Apache Parquet that became the underlying ground between data storage and data lakes and the Parquet analytics. It feels that is a more livable environment and it's continuously changing. I'm very excited about what follows.
Yeah, and I think that's quite an interesting trend there, that we're seeing this fragmentation of these big monolithic systems into composing different building blocks together, where you might take an object store from one vendor and then a columnar data file encoding format, and then have a table format on top of that, and then a choice of different query engines that you could use to run queries over this. And that I found very exciting, because that way, if you can mix and match different components in a way to best suit the needs of your particular application, I think that increases the flexibility for everyone. And it's kind of opens it up for more people to experiment, because you don't have to build a huge system anymore. You can just build one component of a system and reuse other parts, so that it's more open for people to customize and experiment with new approaches.
Another trend that probably was around maybe a little bit earlier before you wrote the book, it was the SQL versus no SQL movement. And at that point, it felt that was the whole revolution. And now probably it will soon come live a discussion with the guys that built QuestDB. What these guys were saying, and it was like, okay, it's a multi-tiered one. And what was interesting for me is like, okay, we have a write-ahead log where you can just write like in a NoSQL style, you just write, you don't care about anything else. Then you have a query engine based on SQL, and then you can query that kind of data that normally you wouldn't have thought that it's queryable via SQL. And then you have the cold storage that's Apache Parquet files that's still queryable, but it's written on the file system. And as you mentioned as well, it's easy to be archived, it's easy to be backed up, because in the end, it's a simple file system storage mechanism. And I think there are a lot of options, maybe too many options if you are in the position of choosing one for your system.
Yeah, definitely.
The other thing that was quite interesting during your keynote, and by the way, kudos for the title, for the listeners that don't know about it, Martin used, I would say, a taboo or normally geopolitics in his title for his keynote, and everybody was very interested about it. One of the points that you mentioned was that having more distributed systems will allow us to be more autonomous, more sovereign, because this is the trendy word these days, as the technology, and that will allow us to be further away from being locked in by vendors, regardless of the nationality or the country where this service is provided. And one of the protocols that you helped build was AT protocol that is underlying the BlueSky social network. Maybe you can give us in a couple of sentences what was your experience into building it, and what are the lessons learned from all your experience with designing data-intensive applications that you brought to the table while designing the protocol?
Yeah, the app protocol is super interesting. I got contacted by Jay Graeber quite early on in the process, just when she was getting the team together to build BlueSky. This was at the time when we still believed this effort was to build a decentralized technology for Twitter at the time. This was before Elon Musk came in and acquired it. And so the idea is that we would just be building an technology infrastructure layer for different social networking apps to run on top of. And then Elon came along, and then plans changed, and Twitter got renamed to X. And well, we then decided that BlueSky needed to be just a social network in its own right, competing directly with the incumbents. But we still managed to keep that ethos, those principles and the values on which the app protocol was originally founded and designed, which was to essentially say that social media is too important to leave it in the hands of a single company. And there are different approaches to how you can decentralize social media. And so I guess one alternative approach is what ActivityPub does, which is what Mastodon is based on. And that has been pretty popular as well, and it works very well for a number of people. And that already existed at the time when we started at Proto, but we deliberately designed at Proto to be different in various ways in order to address what we saw were some issues with the way that ActivityPub worked. But there were also trade-offs. And so in particular, what we wanted for AdProto was to have a technology that would provide a user experience that was basically indistinguishable from a centralized social network. So we wanted the fact that the system is decentralized at the technical level not to result in any weirdness in terms of user experience or any complicated steps or hoops that the users would have to jump through. And you don't have this on Mastodon. So for example, on Mastodon, if you look at the replies to a particular post, if you're looking at the reply thread on one server, you may see an entirely different thread compared to looking at the same reply thread on a different server, the replies to different posts. And that's because not every server knows about all of the replies to a post. I think for ActivityPub, that was just like an intentional, deliberate decision in order to maximize the decentralized, federated nature of the system. But for AdProto, we wanted a consistency. We wanted that if somebody looks at the reply thread, everyone should see the same thing, basically. If you look at like counts, everyone should see the same like count, and so on. And that then implies that there has to be something that essentially indexes the entire network, that looks at any replies that are posted on any of the servers and brings them all together so that they can be shown in a single thread, and that counts all of the likes that happen on all of the servers and adds them up to a single number. And that is done in AdProto by essentially having a fire hose that combines all of the user activity from all of the servers. There's still lots of different servers that store the user data. They're called personal data servers or PDSs. But that's then aggregated into a big fire hose through a service called the relay. And then different organizations can build different services that index this data set. And anyone can come along and take this data set and compute whatever views they want over this data. And to be honest, most of the people using BlueSky now are using the services provided by BlueSky, the company. And as a result, it's somewhat more centralized than a sort of pure federated system like Mastodon is. But we decided that that was a reasonable trade-off, as long as there was this option for users to go and switch to a different service provider if their current service provider ever stopped living up to their expectations. And so that was really the core founding principle behind AdProto, that users should be able to switch to a different provider without having to change anything or without losing any of their data. So they shouldn't lose their username or have to change their username by switching providers. They shouldn't lose any of their posts that they've created or any of the replies from other people on their posts. They shouldn't lose any of their social graph, neither the people they are following or those who are following them. All of that should be easily portable between providers. And that is something that we have managed with AdProto. And there are now also alternative providers that run their own systems, but give you essentially the same data. You can see the same posts and the same reply threads, but via a different provider. That seems to have worked out pretty well, I think, as a design principle that means you get a good user experience for decentralized social media.
Personally, I really like it because it's quite clean and it seems that it has all the attributes that former Twitter had without having the insanity. But to summarize, all the user-related data, it's stored in PDSs, which is personal
data service.
And then you have a backbone where everything, a fire hose in the middle, where all the data is aggregated. So that's publicly available and you can just play with it and everybody can use it. But what BlueSky is doing is just one implementation of the ad protocol, but actually whoever wants to do it can actually do it. And I think you even gave an example of another fire hose during your presentation that appeared in the last period.
Yeah, there's several alternative ones, like BlueSky runs an alternative fire hose, for example.
If we redo a similar protocol, what would be the things that you do differently, if there are any?
I'm pretty happy with how the design of the AdProto has ended up. I mean, I played only a small part in it, right? So I didn't write any of the code in the implementation. That was all done by the BlueSky team. I was just an advisor for maybe an hour a week or so. But I would like to think that some of my thinking about like building scalable data systems has fed into the design. And I think on the whole, the design decisions have worked out pretty well. Whether the system is decentralized or not depends, of course, not just on the protocols, but also on which organizations are actually running services. So you could have a perfectly decentralized protocol, but if no alternative providers are available, then it's all hypothetical. So I'm very happy to see that there are more and more alternative providers to BlueSky providing Proto services now. But that's something that BlueSky itself cannot do kind of by definition. It has to come from the community and from other people. And so there's actually a limit to what BlueSky can do in order to increase that decentralization. Like, I think BlueSky has really done everything right to just open up the data so that it's available for anyone to start competing services. But in the end, it's then up to other people to step up. And it does require some funding, of course, because engineering is necessary and infrastructure is necessary to run these services. But I think we've done what we can to enable it through, for example, open source software, good documentation, and so on.
Local first is something that is closer to you. I know that you wrote also some software that you're very proud of. Can you tell us more what the local first movement actually is and what's its mission? Why did you get it started?
Local first is also, you could argue it's about decentralization, but it's for a different type of app. This is thinking more about collaboration software where you've got a small group of trusted collaborators. For example, in Google Docs, writing a document, or working together on a spreadsheet, or working together on some graphics files, or a bug tracker, or things like that, where it's really about collaboration between a small group of people. And what Local First is, there is a principle for designing this kind of collaboration software in a way where the primary copy of the data is not somewhere on the cloud, but it's on your own machine. You'd have the copy of the data locally on your own machine, which means that you can access it while offline, for example. And you can just keep using the software without an internet connection, and it'll just resync the next time you come back online again. It also means the software is simply faster to use because it doesn't have to wait for a network round trip every time you click a button, but everything can work just off your local storage. I think this is important because it empowers users. It's really about user agency. And also it's about reducing the risk of cloud providers suddenly disappearing. You know, I think probably all of us have had this experience of like using some web-based software that was pretty useful, pretty nice, and then the provider of the software just decided to shut it down. Google Reader is one example that people still cite even a decade after it got shut down because people loved it so much and Google shut it down nevertheless. That's just kind of an inherent problem with software as a service or web-based software. There's no way you can continue running a copy of that software locally on your own machine. If the provider decides to take it away from you, it's gone. If the provider decides to lock you out of your account, well, then you lose all of the files that you ever created with that software. And I find that a really untenable situation where we're just completely dependent on some software providers not locking us out of all of our data. And that's why I think local first is so important, because it means if you have a copy of the data locally on your own machine, nobody can take it away from you. Even if all of the servers go away, maybe you stop being able to collaborate with other users, but at least you've still got a copy of the data yourself. I'm really happy that local first is now beginning to really catch on as a wider industry trend. We're seeing dozens of companies now making local first products and marketing them as local first as well. And this is an attribute of software that people are increasingly caring about as something that is, desirable because it just gives us better software.
For me, it was the guideline or something that I pushed always when architecting or designing a new application. For me, it made no sense when you have quite powerful devices in your pocket. Why something like, for example, Instagram is not working, even though you cached a lot of data on it. And then, you're in flight mode and you don't have access to it. You have a banner and it says, okay, you have to connect. That was one thing, and probably there are others where I knew that the data is cached locally, so I didn't understand why you cannot access it nicely and even take it away. So more or less how you defined it, it feels like it's maybe a little bit more evolved way of Git, because Git, that's in the end the perspective that Git has. You have a copy on your local machine, and then obviously each of the nodes can be the master and so on and so forth. Well, we wanted decentralization, but then GitHub and GitLab and all the other ones appeared, and then we went again to a centralized approach.
Yeah, but Git is actually a fantastic example here, I find, because, it is local first in the sense that all of the data is local, including all of the commit history is local. You can just do inspecting past versions of your repository without talking to any servers. And what's more is that, you mentioned GitHub and GitLab as these points of centralization, which is true, but at least we still have the Git protocol as an open standard sync protocol, which means you can take the same Git repository, push it to GitHub, push the same repository to GitLab, push the same repository to your self-hosted Git service, and it just works. You can just have multiple remotes and it works just fine. This is something we don't have with Google Docs. With Google Docs, you can't change the Google Docs application to use a different syncing service.
Yep.
But really, we should have that, right? And that's one of the things that Local First is aiming to get at. It's not saying that we cannot have cloud services, because to be honest, cloud services are really useful for syncing data from one device to another. We've tried to make stuff work as peer-to-peer, and actually peer-to-peer is just really hard to make work reliably. It's hard to get away from cloud services entirely. But if you can run the system in such a way that you can just use multiple cloud services side by side, just the way you can use multiple Git hosting services side by side, then you've taken away most of the problems of decentralization. And in fact, then we're back to exactly what we were talking about with our proto, where you now have the ability for different providers to provide competing services. And if they use the same protocol, it's an open standard protocol like what Git uses for pulling and pushing its commits, then you actually remove a lot of the lock-in that you would otherwise have with these providers. Of course, with GitHub now, then people still use the issue tracker and the wiki and these other features, which are not stored in Git repositories and therefore not portable from one provider to another. So for those aspects, we still have the centralization.
Yeah, that's a whole different story.
I think it'd be great if those were in Git repositories as well, but that's maybe a longer story. But at least the core Git repository itself is actually very portable across providers. And I think that's a model that other software should emulate.
So just to wrap my head around what you mentioned, local first, the main target is for more broader used technology, like you gave the example of Google Docs. So textual editors, or we can have also issue trackers and stuff like that that are broader used, because technology, Git particularly, is used by people that are more tech savvy. And the local first is thought about having the ability of actually moving your stuff to another provider. Because we had that period when you bought software with boxes, CDs, whatever. Then we had the SAS movement, and then that meant, as you said, acquisitions, services that are killed, and so on and so forth. And then you just remain with nothing, because most often than not, they just give you an export that nobody's supposed to import. And now we are trying to decouple that. It's one thing, I want to be able to work with my data. And if I choose to have it in the cloud or backups, this should be something democratized and available for the broad amount of people, not only for technology enthusiasts.
I think that's absolutely right. So we software engineers have Git, but Git has a brutal learning curve. And moreover, you can't really use it for anything that's not text files. Yeah, you can put a spreadsheet, an Excel file in Git, but you won't get any meaningful diffing or merging of that. It'll just treat it as an opaque binary blob. So part of our goal with local first here is to take the power of systems like Git and make it accessible to people for whom using the Git as a command line tool is just not appropriate. So we want, for example, spreadsheets. We want them to have the same kind of real-time collaboration that we've got used to from cloud software. But at the same time, we also want the local data storage and the ability to sync via different sync providers that we know from Git, for example. Also, we want the version control features from Git. This is another thing that, again, we software engineers take for granted that, yes, obviously we can review what changes our colleague made last week while I was on holiday, or do code reviews on pull requests. This is just part of the natural workflow of software engineering. Many other businesses, many other professions don't have the similar kind of version control tooling. People build very sophisticated financial models in spreadsheets, and they don't have version control for spreadsheets. It's a shocking situation, really. But part of the nice thing with local first is because in order to sync the edits that you make from one user's machine to another user's machine, we have to capture what those edits are anyway and encode them in a way that we can store on disk and send over the network. And so if we're capturing the edits anyway, it's actually not that big a leap to also make this into a version control system that can keep the version history of the editing over time and let people see what changes their colleague made last week and to diff one version of a file against another version. It's actually exactly technically the same mechanism that's needed. That's another reason why I'm excited about local firsts. It's empowering people, not just in the sense of ensuring that they don't lose all of their data if their cloud provider goes away, but also empowering people by bringing this power version control to many other apps that currently don't have version control.
One reason why I'm very excited about it is because I have an ongoing saga with my colleagues. I'm currently working for an IoT company. And for me, it's a bit of a problem, not to call it other way, because we have the design of the hardware. It's impossible to version it, not in the way how we are used. We cannot compare, iteration 1 or version 3 properly and just see what changed. And it's a whole different problem because you have file storage, and then only the person that actually built it knows what's there. And I'm totally behind you.
Exactly. Even CAD software used by engineers for physical product design or electronic engineering for circuit diagrams, even that doesn't have version control. It's unbelievable.
And not in the sense that we know from software, you just have a nice little diff where you have with red the component that was taken out and with green the component that was put in, because that will be amazing. Just technically speaking, what is local first? Is it a set of principles and then it's up to each individual, each software to define its way of doing? Because it's not a protocol.
Yeah, it's a sense of principles and values, I would say. Then there are lots of different software implementations that interpret those principles in various different ways. So my collaborators and I work on a software implementation called AutoMerge. It's an open source library that you can use to build collaboration software. So it provides a data model for storing the data of an application, and it can automatically sync that from one machine to another. It can do real-time collaboration, but it can do version control-like use cases as well, where you want to go off on a branch for a while and then diff the branch against its space and then decide later whether to merge it or not. It can do all of those types of things, and it can do it for different file types. So you can use it for text editing, or for spreadsheets, or for graphics, or presentation software, for CAD software. People have built all sorts of different types of apps on top of AutoMerge already.
Okay. Even it's a library, means that is implemented in a language. What languages are currently available for?
So it's implemented in Rust, which we chose because we get very good portability across basically all operating systems and platforms. So if you want to use it in a web browser, we compile the Rust to WebAssembly and then have a TypeScript wrapper around it. And that's actually the way that most people use AutoMerge. But there are also native bindings in Swift for iOS and in Java for Android. There are I think Python bindings, there are Go bindings, C bindings. So pretty much all the popular programming languages.
Well, given that Rust has a compile into WebAssembly, I think that's pretty good because WebAssembly is now incorporated in most of the technology stacks. So that's a nice way to take it on board.
Yeah, WASM is well supported now. It's still kind of an adventure to incorporate WASM into the JavaScript ecosystem. There's plenty of friction there across that boundary. But it works well enough, and it does mean that we can use the same optimized algorithms across all of the language implementations. We have put a lot of effort into optimizing the internal data structures inside AutoMerge.
If I would like to start working on something, the best place to start is go have AutoMerge incorporated and start playing around it.
That's what we suggest, yeah.
Okay, what would be a hello world that you would recommend to somebody that wants to get started with something?
Well, I guess a common hello world would be like a simple to-do list app also that syncs between devices. a to-do list would be very easy to represent in auto-merge.
Now I understand why you chose JavaScript to give as an example that is harder to achieve, because that's the go-to example for all JavaScript frameworks, building a to-do list.
But if you build it with auto-merge, it'll sync across different devices. So that's something that JavaScript out of the box doesn't give you.
Well, if you solve the JavaScript problem, you should get a Nobel Prize for peace, because JavaScript ecosystem, probably since we started talking, they have like 10, 20 new libraries that appeared. So thank you for that. Okay. Do you have a registry of all, let's say, local first software that was built with auto-merge? Is it like an awesome list where we can just go and see this kind of local first?
That would be a really good thing to have. To be honest, we don't always hear about it because, it's an open source project. Of course, anyone can just use it without letting us know. Occasionally we get like bug reports from people, and then that way we find out that they're actually using auto-merge in production. It's always nice to hear the stories. But yeah, we should actually try and put together a list like that. We do have a couple of companies voluntarily sponsoring the development of auto-merge. And so we're very grateful to them for financially supporting the project. But it's not required. It's just an optional sponsorship.
What would be the limitations? Where do you think using auto-merge or just trying to implement it by yourself, it's currently not feasible to think about these kind of applications? Is there somewhere that you say, okay, it's not good enough at this point, it has limits?
I would use local first in general for apps where the user edits the data themselves in whatever way they want, basically. And so that means it works well for apps, that are used for creative purposes, but also as I keep mentioning spreadsheets as an example, or graphics. Those are all things where the user can edit the data in whatever way they like. It makes less sense for data where, say, it's a bank account, where, yes, in principle, you can edit the balance of your bank account and add an extra zero, but that doesn't make you actually have more money in your bank account. In the end, the bank has the authoritative copy of what your bank account balance is. And if you edit that locally on your own machine, that doesn't really mean anything. So for that type of software, local first doesn't really make sense because there's an authoritative copy on a server somewhere, and it has to be that way. Also, if it's like an online shop, for example, in principle, you could make an online shop local first, but that would mean that you download the entire product catalog to your local device, which means you could browse offline, which maybe is convenient, but also the catalog will contain 1 million items, of which you're only interested in 3. And so downloading everything up front doesn't really make sense there either. And also, customers of the online shop are not going to edit the product descriptions in the product catalog. That doesn't make sense either. So that's why I say that local first makes most sense for these kind of creation apps where the user is creating the data themselves.
It's like having a local first copy of Amazon is just having like a leaflet. That doesn't guarantee that the product you want to buy is still in the shop.
So with something like the stock in a warehouse, that's just inherently centralized because there's a physical resource and the computer just reflects what is actually on the shelf of the warehouse.
We discussed about getting started with something. Is local first something that you can retrofit? We have an application that currently is centralized and we would like to adhere to the set of best practices. Is it something appropriate? Can we do something about that for the new generation?
I think it depends a lot how the app is built. One of the nice things with local first is that it means essentially all of the business logic of the application is client-side. And you can still build it as a web app, that's fine. Or you can build it as desktop native software if you like, it doesn't really matter. If your software is currently built in a way that it already maintains its internal state client-side, as JavaScript state variables in a web app, for example, then you can make it local first without too much trouble, usually, because essentially you would be taking that internal client-side data model that the application already has and putting a sync engine on it so that that data can sync to your collaborators. And we have done that kind of retrofit previously. So take an existing single-user React app, for example, and just replace its internal data model with auto-merge, and then you get a multi-user app. In some cases, that can be pretty straightforward. But if your current app architecture relies on a server doing a bunch of business logic, then that's harder to retrofit to local first because you would then be changing the locus of that business logic to be client side rather than server side.
Okay, so the short answer is obviously it depends. If you were inspired when you started with the application in the first place and you keep the parts of the model that you actually need on the client side, then it's easier. Otherwise, probably it would be a bigger redesign and probably it would be a lot easier to just get started from scratch and just move there all the features that you need.
Yes, probably.
Okay. How can people contribute?
I think just trying to build some apps with auto-merge is probably a good place to get started. There are a bunch of other libraries also that aim to make it possible to play with local first software, so it doesn't have to be auto-merge. That's just the one that I happen to work on and like. But if you look on localfirst.fm, there's a nice comparison table of lots of different software libraries there that can all be used to build local first software. Yes, I think building some apps is a good way to get started. And then if it turns out that you're actually more interested in the underlying infrastructure behind the apps, then of course you can go deep on that, and everything is open source and open for contributions. We always have ongoing work to improve the performance, for example, and new designs of the data synchronization protocols. We're in the process of adding end-to-end encryption and a decentralized access control system to the protocol. So that there's lots of ongoing work happening. And for anyone who's interested in those infrastructural implementation aspects, that's all open for contributors as well. For auto-merge, we also have a Discord chat server where all of the core developers are available. So that's quite a good place for communication, finding other people who are interested and getting questions answered.
Okay. And talking about community, I know that you and the Local First community are running a conference. I think it's July in Berlin.
Yeah, it's very exciting. The Local First conference started in 2024, so this is the third year that it's running. At first, we were not sure, was Local First really big enough to justify having a conference dedicated just to that topic? But the first edition sold out, the second edition sold out, and I hear the tickets for this year's conference are going quickly as well. And it's been really cool to just see so many different people all sharing these values of what Local First is about, trying all sorts of different software implementations. In some cases, they're competing software implementations that are trying to solve the same problem, but that's okay and that's healthy and that's good part of having an ecosystem, I think. And what this conference is doing this year is now broadening the scope a bit. So focusing less on the detailed technical aspects of, say, sync engines, which are used to sync data between clients and servers. There's lots of interesting algorithms and protocols there to talk about, but actually the conference is broadening scope a bit more to really look at these themes of user agency, user empowerment, which is really the whole reason why we're doing Local First in the first place. And this then actually connects very nicely to the AT protocol discussion from earlier as well, because similarly, AppProto is founded on these values of empowering users by reducing lock-in, allowing users to port their data from one service to another service. It's just that AppProto does it for the social media domain, Local First does it for the collaboration software domain, but otherwise, in terms of the underlying principles, actually, they are very similar. And so I'm really happy to see the AppProto and the Local First community coming together. And so, for example, Paul Frazee, who's the CTO of BlueSky and one of the core designers of the app protocol, will be speaking at the Local First conference.
So that will be in July in Berlin for 2 days, and you can find it online. From what I know, it's a venue that is limited, so it still feels like a tight-knit community.
Yeah, I think about 350 people.
That's a good size.
Big enough to be interesting, small enough that it still feels like a real community.
Yeah, sounds like the proper size. Okay, Martin, thank you for your time.
It's been a great discussion. Thanks.